Have you ever seen a moment so quiet, yet so powerful that it changes a man's entire life? Imagine this. A powerful millionaire walks out into the freezing night behind his mansion, a gun in his hand, expecting danger. But instead, he finds something he will never forget. A poor maid, asleep on a stone bench, her thin uniform barely protecting her from the cold wind. And in her arms, his baby son. The child he thought was safe inside a warm nursery was now wrapped in an old worn blanket that clearly didn't belong to a house worth millions. The rich man stood there frozen, because what he saw next shattered everything he believed about love. But the real truth behind that moment, the reason that poor woman chose to sleep outside in the freezing cold holding someone else's child, that truth would break his heart in ways he never expected. Before we begin, take a moment to subscribe to the channel if you enjoy heartfelt stories about love, sacrifice, and the quiet heroes who change lives. Now let's go back to the beginning, because this story didn't start in that garden. It started long before that night. It started with a man who had everything, except the ability to love. Cade Mercer was one of the richest and most feared men in Chicago. At 36 years old, he owned restaurants, real estate projects, and businesses across the Midwest. People called him a millionaire. Some called him a genius. Others whispered darker things behind closed doors. But one thing was certain. Cade Mercer controlled power. The kind of power that made people go silent when he walked into a room. The kind of power that came from 22 years of building an empire in a world where mistakes cost lives. And Cade learned that lesson early. When he was 14 years old, he watched his father die on a sidewalk. 3 gunshots. 2 to the chest. 1 to the head. His father collapsed in front of him on a cold Chicago afternoon while Cade stood frozen with a grocery bag in his hands. Before his father died, he told him something Cade never forgot. Never let anyone know what matters to you, because what you love will become the weapon used against you. Those words shaped Cade Mercer's life. He grew up believing love was weakness. So he never let anyone get close. Not friends. Not partners. Not family. For years, his world became simple. Money. Power. Control. And nothing else. Until one day, a baby changed everything. The baby wasn't planned. Asher Mercer came into the world after a brief relationship with a wealthy socialite Cade met at a charity gala. The relationship didn't last long. 2 weeks after giving birth, the woman left the mansion. She left the baby in his crib. And a note on the kitchen table. I wasn't made to be a mother. That was it. No apology. No explanation. Just a quiet goodbye. Cade stood in the nursery that morning staring down at a sleeping newborn. He didn't know how to be a father. So he did what he always did. He solved the problem with money. He hired a professional nanny. Installed cameras in the nursery. Set up breathing monitors. Security systems. Emergency medical contacts. Everything a wealthy man could buy to keep a child safe. But Cade himself stayed distant. Every night when he came home late, he would walk past the nursery door. He would pause. Listen to the tiny breathing of his son inside. Then he would keep walking. Like a guard checking a security system. Not like a father visiting his child. Because in Cade Mercer's world, love created weakness. And weakness created enemies. But 3 floors below that nursery, there lived someone very different. A woman no one noticed. Her name was Josie Thorne. She arrived at the mansion 6 months earlier with a small fabric suitcase. Inside it were 2 changes of clothes, a pair of worn shoes, and an old blue blanket folded carefully at the bottom. Josie had come from a poor town in the mountains of West Virginia. No college degree. No savings. No family. Just quiet hands used to hard work. Her job in the Mercer mansion was simple. Clean everything. Speak little. Disappear. She scrubbed marble floors until they shined. Washed dishes. Polished stair railings. Changed sheets in rooms larger than the house she grew up in. Most days, no one even looked at her. The staff ate together in the kitchen. But Josie usually sat alone in the laundry room beside the dryer. The warm air from the machine was the closest thing she had to comfort in that enormous house. She never complained. Never asked for anything. But there was one place in the mansion where her steps always slowed. The nursery. Sometimes late at night, when the halls were quiet and the nanny had gone to her room, Josie would hear something through the house intercom. A baby crying. At first she ignored it. It wasn't her job. But the crying didn't stop. So one night, she opened the nursery door. Inside the room, under the soft yellow glow of a nightlight, little Asher Mercer lay in his crib crying into the darkness. Josie walked over slowly. She lifted him into her arms. And something strange happened. The baby stopped crying instantly. His tiny fingers grabbed the collar of her shirt, holding tight. Like he knew. Like he understood something adults often forget. That sometimes the safest place in the world isn't money. It's a human heart. Josie rocked him gently. And under her breath, she began to sing. A quiet, old hymn her mother used to sing back in the mountains. A song she had not sung in years. A song she once sang to another child, long ago. And every night after that, when the mansion slept, when the rich rooms fell silent, Josie would step into the nursery and hold the millionaire's baby in the quiet dark. But what no one in that mansion knew, not Cade, not the nanny, not the staff, was the heartbreaking reason Josie could never ignore a child's cry. Because years earlier, on a freezing winter night in West Virginia, Josie had already lost a child once. And the memory of that night was something she carried with her everywhere, especially in that old blue blanket, the same blanket she kept hidden in her suitcase, the same blanket that would soon save Cade Mercer's son on the coldest night of the year. And that night was closer than anyone in the mansion realized. Winter arrived in Chicago early that year. The kind of winter that crept into your bones even when you were inside warm buildings. The kind that turned the wind coming off Lake Michigan into something sharp and unforgiving. Inside the Greystone mansion, however, winter was barely noticeable. The heating system hummed quietly through the walls. Fireplaces glowed in large marble rooms. Expensive rugs covered the cold floors. Everything in Cade Mercer's world was built to keep the cold out. But one night, something small changed. Something no one noticed. At 10 o'clock sharp, June Whitfield finished her shift like she always did. She walked into the nursery, checked the baby monitor, adjusted the blanket over Asher's small body, and switched the main lights off. The soft night light cast a pale yellow glow across the room. "Asleep at 10. She muttered quietly as she wrote the note in her logbook. Routine. Everything in order. She left the nursery and closed the door behind her. Downstairs, Cade Mercer had already left the house earlier that evening. A business meeting on the south side of Chicago had taken longer than expected. Deals in Cade's world rarely ended with polite handshakes. Sometimes they ended with threats. Sometimes with blood. By the time his car disappeared down the long driveway of the mansion, the house had settled into its usual nighttime silence. June went to her private room and set her phone on silent. Boyd Stratton, the butler, checked the security system and then retired to his own quarters. The lights in the mansion dimmed one by one. And slowly, the temperature in the nursery began to drop. Not suddenly. Quietly. Like warmth slipping out of a room one breath at a time. The central heating system had stopped working. A silent system error. No alarms. No loud warning. Just cold air replacing warm air inside the gray stone walls. Asher stirred in his crib. At first, it was only a small movement beneath the blanket. His tiny fingers curled. His feet kicked softly. The baby shifted in his sleep as the room grew colder. Then his eyes squeezed shut and a small cry escaped his throat. Weak. Confused. He kicked the blanket aside. The cry grew louder. 5 minutes passed. 10 minutes. The room was colder now. The nightlight cast a pale glow across the nursery walls, but the warmth that usually filled the space had vanished. Asher's cheeks turned red from crying. His tiny hands waved helplessly in the air. His voice cracked as he cried harder. But the house was silent. June slept behind a closed door. Boyd lay in his bed downstairs. Cade Mercer was miles away in a warehouse filled with men who carried guns. No one heard the baby. No one except one person. In the kitchen, Josie stood at the sink scrubbing a stainless steel pan. Her yellow rubber gloves squeaked softly against the metal as warm water ran over her hands. The mansion's kitchen intercom blinked faintly on the wall. Most of the staff ignored it. But Josie had learned to listen. And tonight, she heard it. A small sound crackled through the speaker. A cry. She froze. Her hands stopped moving under the running water. For a moment she stood perfectly still, listening. The cry came again. Thin. Desperate. A baby's cry. Josie looked up slowly at the clock on the wall. 11 o'clock. She waited. Maybe the nanny would come. Maybe someone upstairs had already heard it. 1 minute passed. 2 minutes. The crying didn't stop. If anything, it sounded worse. Josie removed her hands from the sink and wiped them on a cloth. Her chest felt tight. Because something about that cry felt wrong. Not ordinary crying. Not the fussy sound of a baby who wanted milk. This sounded weak. She glanced toward the hallway leading to June's room. Dark. Silent. No footsteps. The cry through the intercom cracked again. Dry and strained. Josie swallowed. She knew the rules of this house. She wasn't the nanny. She wasn't family. She was the woman who scrubbed floors. But the crying kept going. And every second she stood there, it reminded her of something she tried very hard not to remember. Another winter. Another night. Another cry. Her hands trembled slightly. Josie untied her apron and set it on the counter. She didn't remove the yellow gloves. She left the kitchen and walked down the dark hallway. The mansion felt colder than usual. Her bare footsteps echoed softly on the stone floor. She climbed the staircase slowly. With every step upward, the air felt colder. By the time she reached the second floor, she could see her breath. The hallway lights were off. Only the faint yellow glow from the nursery door spilled into the corridor. The crying was louder now. Josie placed her hand on the nursery door handle. It was freezing. She pushed the door open. The cold hit her face instantly. The nursery felt like a cellar. The window on the north wall rattled softly as icy wind pressed against the glass. Inside the crib, Asher cried weakly beneath the pale nightlight. His blanket had been kicked away. His tiny hands were stiff with cold. Josie stepped forward quickly. "Oh, baby," she whispered. She lifted him into her arms. The moment his small body touched her chest, the crying stopped. Not slowly. Immediately. Asher buried his face into the collar of her uniform. His little fingers grabbed the fabric tightly. Josie felt his cold hands against her neck. Her heart sank. "Lord," she murmured under her breath. She pulled out her phone with one hand and called June. The phone rang. And rang. No answer. She tried Boyd next. Voicemail. Josie stood in the freezing nursery holding the baby. Her eyes drifted toward the staff emergency contact number posted on the wall. Cade Mercer. She stared at it for a long moment. Then she shook her head slightly. No. She couldn't call the boss in the middle of the night. But the baby in her arms trembled against her chest. Josie looked down at him again. His lips were pale. His breathing uneven. And suddenly, she knew the mansion was no place for him tonight. She held him tighter. "I got you," she whispered softly. Then she turned toward the door. Because the only warmth she knew in this entire house wasn't inside the mansion at all. It was outside, near the laundry vent, beside the stone bench in the garden. Josie stepped out into the garden with the baby held tight against her chest. The cold wind hit her immediately. Chicago winters were cruel, and the wind that came across Lake Michigan had a way of cutting straight through clothes and skin. It felt sharper out here than inside the mansion, yet Josie kept walking. Because she knew something about this garden that no one else in that house paid attention to. She crossed the gravel path carefully, her shoes crunching softly beneath her steps. The mansion loomed behind her, tall and silent, its windows glowing faintly with expensive lights. But the warmth inside those walls wasn't reaching the nursery tonight. And right now, the only thing that mattered was the small body trembling in her arms. Asher pressed his face deeper against her chest. His tiny fingers clutched the collar of her uniform as if he understood somehow that she was the one thing keeping him warm. Josie walked toward the south wall of the property. There, beside the laundry room vent, stood a simple stone bench. Most people in the mansion didn't even know it existed. But Josie knew. She sat there every afternoon during her short lunch break. The vent from the laundry room released a soft stream of warm air from the dryers running inside. It wasn't much. But on cold days, it was the warmest place in the garden. She lowered herself slowly onto the bench, pulling the baby closer to her body. "Sure, it's all right," she whispered softly. The warmth from the vent brushed faintly across the stone behind her. Josie tucked her legs slightly inward, forming a small shield around Asher's body. Then she remembered something. The blanket. Her heart tightened as the thought crossed her mind. Josie shifted the baby into one arm and reached down into the pocket of her apron. Her fingers brushed against the edge of a thin cloth she had folded there earlier. But it wasn't enough. She stood up again quickly and hurried back inside the mansion through the back door. The kitchen was dark and quiet. Josie walked straight to the small closet where staff kept their belongings. At the bottom of her worn suitcase, folded carefully like something sacred, lay the old blue blanket she had carried with her from West Virginia. Her hand hovered over it for a moment. 4 years. For long years had passed since she last wrapped a child in this blanket. The memories tried to rush forward the moment her fingers touched the faded fabric. A small trailer in the mountains. A coughing child. A winter night colder than anything she had ever felt. Josie swallowed hard and picked up the blanket. "Not tonight," she whispered to herself. She wrapped Asher carefully in the blue cloth, pulling it snug around his small body before stepping back outside into the freezing air. The stone bench waited beside the laundry vent, just as she remembered. Josie sat down again and leaned back against the cold wall. Asher's tiny body rested against her chest, wrapped in the thin blanket while her arms formed another layer of protection around him. His breathing slowly softened. The trembling stopped. Josie closed her eyes for a moment as relief washed through her. "There you go, little one," she murmured. The baby's fingers relaxed slightly but still held onto her collar as if letting go would make her disappear. Josie began to rock gently, moving just enough to soothe him. Then, almost without thinking, she began to sing. The melody came quietly at first. A soft, "Hold him." Her voice was low and fragile, carried into the cold night air like a prayer whispered into the wind. It was the same song her mother used to sing back in the mountains of Appalachia when the winters grew harsh and the firewood ran low. the same song Josie once sang while holding her own son late into the night. The memory crept up slowly now, the way painful memories often do. Levi's small curls brushing against her chin. The way his little fingers used to grab her shirt while he slept. The way he used to smile even when there was barely enough food in the house. Josie's voice trembled slightly, but she kept singing. Asher slept peacefully against her chest now. His breathing was steady and warm against her neck. Josie stared out into the dark garden. For a moment, time felt strange. Like the past and the present were overlapping. Like two different children had once rested in the exact same place in her arms. One she had lost. And one she was refusing to lose tonight. Midnight passed quietly. The mansion behind her remained silent. Inside, expensive rooms filled with soft beds and warm lights continued their quiet sleep. But outside, on a cold stone bench beside a laundry vent, a poor woman held a millionaire's child like the most precious thing in the world. Her arms tightened around him whenever the wind picked up. Hours passed that way. Josie tried to stay awake. But exhaustion slowly pulled at her eyelids. 7 months without a single day off. Early mornings. Late nights. Lonely lunches beside the dryer. And now this long winter night. Her head tilted back against the stone wall. Still she held him tightly. One gloved hand supported his back. The other shielded his chest from the wind. Asher slept deeply against her. His small fingers still hooked into the fabric of her uniform. Josie drifted into a light sleep just before dawn. And that was exactly how Cade Mercer found them. The powerful businessman returned to the mansion at 2:15 in the morning. His car rolled quietly into the garage after a long night of negotiations across the city. There had been arguments. Threats. One man had even been dragged out of the warehouse bleeding. Cade sat in the driver's seat for a moment before stepping out. His white shirt cuff carried a dark stain that wasn't his blood. He removed his shoes inside the house and walked barefoot across the stone floor, moving through the mansion like he always did in the late hours. Quiet. Careful. A man used to darkness. His nightly routine never changed. Before going to bed, he always stopped outside the nursery door. He listened for his son's breathing. Tonight, when he reached the door, something felt wrong. The hallway was too quiet. Cade pushed the door open. The crib was empty. The blanket lay tossed to one side. For 1 second, his heart stopped. Then it slammed violently in his chest. His instincts kicked in instantly. Years in a dangerous world had trained his body to react before his mind caught up. He rushed to his bedroom, opened the nightstand drawer, and grabbed the Beretta resting inside. Cold metal settled firmly in his palm. He checked the security cameras on his phone. No break-ins. No open gates. No alarms. Which meant only one thing. Whatever happened, happened inside the house. Cade tore through the mansion quickly. Living room. Office. Kitchen. Nothing. Then he noticed something strange. The back door was slightly open. Cold air drifted inside. Cade stepped outside slowly, the gun ready in his hand. The wind brushed across his bare feet on the gravel. And that's when he saw them. A figure on the stone bench beside the south wall. A woman in a cleaning uniform. Her head tilted back in sleep. Yellow rubber gloves still covering her hands. And in her arms, his son. Cade Mercer stopped walking. The gravel beneath his bare feet shifted slightly as he froze in place, the Beretta still held low in his right hand. The cold wind moved through the garden, but for a moment he didn't feel it. His eyes stayed locked on the stone bench. Josie sat there with her back against the wall, her head tilted slightly to one side in sleep. The pale yellow light from the laundry vent cast a faint glow across her face, showing the exhaustion in every line beneath her eyes. But Cade wasn't looking at her face. He was looking at the child in her arms. Asher was wrapped tightly in an old blue blanket that clearly didn't belong to the Mercer mansion. The cloth looked worn and thin, the kind of blanket someone kept not because it was valuable, but because it carried a history. The baby's face was buried gently against Josie's chest. His tiny hands were curled into the fabric of her uniform. And he was sleeping peacefully. Cade's grip on the gun loosened slightly. He had walked outside expecting danger. His instincts had already built a dozen violent possibilities in his mind. Kidnapping. Intruders. Someone trying to hurt his son. But none of those things were in front of him now. Instead, there was only silence. The quiet rise and fall of a baby's breathing. And the stillness of a woman who had clearly been sitting there for hours. Josie's arms were wrapped tightly around the child even in sleep. One gloved hand supported the baby's back, while the other rested across his chest as if shielding him from the wind. Cade stepped closer. Slowly. Carefully. Not because he feared waking her, but because something about the moment felt strangely fragile. The gun suddenly felt useless in his hand. He lowered it and set it gently on the stone step beside the path. Then he approached the bench. The closer he came, the more details he noticed. Josie's lips were slightly cracked from the cold. A few strands of light brown hair had escaped the tie at the back of her neck, moving gently with the wind. Her yellow rubber gloves were worn thin at the fingertips, the surface faded from months of cleaning chemicals. And still, she held the baby like nothing else in the world mattered. Cade reached forward slowly. His hand brushed lightly against the blue blanket wrapped around Asher. The fabric was warm. Warm from Josie's body heat. For a long moment, Cade simply stood there, watching. His son stirred slightly in Josie's arms but didn't wake. Instead, Asher shifted closer against her chest, tightening his small grip on the fabric of her uniform. The movement was instinctive. Trusting. Like the baby knew without thinking that this was the safest place he could be. Cade felt something unfamiliar move through his chest. Something heavy. Something he hadn't allowed himself to feel for years. He had spent most of his life believing one simple rule his father had taught him. Love made you weak. Love gave your enemies something to destroy. So Cade had built walls around himself. Walls made of money, power, distance. Even with his own son, he kept those walls intact. He made sure Asher was protected. He hired the best care. Installed the most expensive security. But he never held the boy for long. Never allowed himself to get too close. Yet here was a woman with nothing. A housekeeper who slept in a small room beside the laundry machines. A woman who scrubbed floors while the rest of the house ignored her existence. And she had spent the night outside in freezing weather, holding his child like her life depended on it. Cade exhaled slowly. The sound stirred Josie from sleep. Her eyes opened suddenly. For a moment she looked confused, her gaze adjusting to the faint light of the garden. Then she saw him standing in front of her. Her body stiffened instantly. Josie tightened her arms around the baby, pulling Asher closer to her chest by instinct. Her eyes widened slightly as she looked at the tall figure standing over her. "I'm sorry," she whispered immediately, her voice rough from the cold. "I'm so sorry, sir." Cade didn't answer right away. He studied her face carefully. There was no defiance there. No excuses. Just exhaustion. And fear. But not fear for herself. Her arms around the baby told him exactly what she feared losing. Cade's voice came out low and calm. "Why?" Just one word. Josie swallowed, glancing down at the sleeping baby before looking back up at him. "The heat stopped working," she said softly. He started crying, and no one came. Her voice remained quiet but steady. "I tried calling June. I tried Boyd." She shook her head slightly. No one answered. Cade listened without interrupting. The wind moved gently through the garden as she continued. "He was cold," Josie said, her voice breaking just a little. "I didn't know what else to do." Silence settled between them again. Cade looked down at the baby. Asher's breathing was calm now. His tiny fingers were still hooked into the collar of Josie's uniform. Cade noticed something else. The way Josie's body leaned slightly forward even while sitting, shielding the child from the wind. A protective posture. One that didn't come from training. It came from instinct. He looked back at her. "How long were you out here?" Josie hesitated. "I'm not sure," she admitted quietly. "Maybe midnight." Cade glanced toward the mansion. The sky above Chicago was beginning to soften with the faint gray of early morning. She had been out here for hours, holding his child in the freezing cold. The thought settled heavily in his chest. Finally, Cade spoke again. "Come inside." The words weren't sharp. They weren't even an order. Just two simple words. Josie nodded quickly. Her legs trembled slightly as she stood from the bench, still holding Asher carefully against her chest. Cade picked up the Beretta from the stone step but didn't put it back in his waistband. Instead, he carried it loosely in his hand as they walked toward the back door. When they entered the warm kitchen, the difference in temperature hit them instantly. Josie gently laid the baby in the portable crib near the table. Asher stirred but didn't wake. The blue blanket remained wrapped around him. Cade pulled out a chair at the long oak table. Not the small table used by staff. The main table. The one where only he and Cordelia usually sat. "Sit," he said quietly. Josie hesitated for a moment before lowering herself into the chair. Her yellow gloves rested awkwardly in her lap. Her eyes stayed lowered. Cade sat across from her. For several seconds, neither of them spoke. The kitchen felt strangely quiet. Then Cade leaned forward slightly. His gaze remained on her hands. "Who taught you to hold a child like that?" he asked. Josie's eyes lifted slowly. For a moment she looked toward the baby sleeping beside them. Then her gaze drifted somewhere far away, to a place that clearly wasn't this mansion. Her voice was barely louder than a breath when she answered. "My son." The words hung in the air between them. "My son." Cade didn't move. His hand, resting on the edge of the oak table, tightened slightly. For a moment he thought he had misheard her. In the 6 months she had worked in his house, Josie had barely spoken more than a few polite sentences. He knew nothing about her. Not where she came from. Not what her life had been before she started scrubbing the floors of the Mercer mansion. And now suddenly, there was a son. Cade looked toward the portable crib beside the table. Asher slept peacefully beneath the worn blue blanket, his breathing slow and steady. Then Cade's gaze returned to Josie. Her eyes weren't looking at him anymore. They were fixed on the baby. But they weren't really seeing the baby either. Her eyes had drifted somewhere far away. "To be honest," Cade said quietly, "I didn't know you had a child." Josie swallowed. Her gloved fingers tightened slightly in her lap. "I did," she said softly. The past tense did not escape Cade. Silence stretched for a few seconds. The early morning light began to creep slowly through the kitchen windows, soft gray turning gradually into pale gold. Josie finally spoke again. His name was Levi. Cade leaned back slightly in the chair, listening. He was 2 years old. Her voice stayed calm, but something about it carried a weight Cade recognized immediately. Not anger. Not bitterness. Just a kind of quiet sorrow that had been sitting inside her for a long time. He had light curls, she continued, and this big smile, always smiling at everything. Josie let out a small breath that almost sounded like a laugh. He used to grab my shirt when he fell asleep. Just like your boy does. Cade glanced toward Asher again. The baby's small hand was still hooked around the edge of Josie's apron, even in sleep. Josie noticed the glance. "That's why I didn't wake him earlier," she said gently. "He holds on tight when he feels safe." Cade's chest tightened slightly at that word. Safe. Josie looked down at her hands. "We lived in West Virginia," she continued quietly. "A little trailer outside a mining town." Her voice stayed steady, but Cade could hear the exhaustion behind it. "My mama passed from cancer when Levi was just a baby. After that, it was just the two of us." She paused. "I worked cleaning houses during the day, washing dishes at a diner at night." Cade listened without interrupting. "Some nights," she said, "I'd come home so tired I couldn't even keep my eyes open. But Levi, he'd still be awake waiting for me." Her lips trembled slightly, but she kept speaking. "One winter, the heat in our trailer stopped working." Cade felt his chest tighten again. The same words. Heat stopped working. The same thing that had happened in the mansion tonight. Josie continued slowly. "I thought it was just a cold at first. Levi started coughing, running a fever." She looked toward the window for a moment before continuing. "I didn't have the money to take him to a doctor." Cade's jaw clenched slightly. "I held him all night," Josie said quietly. "Wrapped him in blankets, singing to him, praying he'd feel better by morning." Her eyes returned to the baby sleeping in the crib. But when morning came, her voice finally cracked. He was gone. The kitchen fell completely silent. Even the hum of the refrigerator seemed to fade. Josie lowered her head slightly. "I kept telling myself if I had done something different, if I had money, if I had gotten help sooner." She shook her head slowly. But none of that changed anything. Cade didn't know what to say. For most of his life he had dealt with problems using power, money, or violence. This was none of those things. This was grief. The kind that never really left. Josie looked at the blue blanket wrapped around Asher. "That blanket," she said softly, "was the one Levi slept with." Cade followed her gaze. The faded cloth suddenly looked different now. Not just old. Not just worn. It carried a history. "That's why you kept him warm tonight," Cade said quietly. Josie nodded. "I couldn't let another child shiver through the night like that." Her voice was almost a whisper. "I promised myself after Levi, if I ever held a baby again, I wouldn't let anything happen to them." Cade stared at her. For the first time since she had started working in his house, he truly saw her. Not the quiet woman pushing a mop through hallways. Not the invisible housekeeper eating lunch alone in the laundry room. But a mother. A woman who had once lost everything. And who had quietly been protecting his son for months without asking for recognition. Cade looked down at his hands. They were large, rough in a different way than hers. Hands used to holding guns. Signing contracts. Making decisions that affected entire organizations. And yet tonight, those hands had been useless, while the thin hands inside yellow rubber gloves had saved his child from the cold. After a long moment, Cade stood from the chair. Josie looked up slightly, uncertain. Cade walked to a cabinet and opened it. He pulled out a thick, warm blanket and returned to the table. Without saying anything, he draped it gently over Josie's shoulders. She looked surprised. "You're still freezing," he said quietly. Josie opened her mouth as if to protest, then closed it again. "Thank you," she whispered. Cade nodded once. Then he turned slightly toward the crib. Asher shifted in his sleep. His small hand reached out again, instinctively searching. Without thinking, Josie stood and stepped closer. Her fingers gently touched the baby's hand. Immediately, Asher's grip tightened around her finger. He relaxed again. The moment was so natural, so instinctive, that Cade felt something deep inside him shift. But across the city, in a penthouse apartment overlooking Chicago's skyline, someone else had already received news about the heating failure at the mansion. And unlike Cade, she wasn't thinking about the baby. She was thinking about something far more dangerous. Control. And the moment she realized Cade Mercer had begun paying attention to a poor housekeeper, Cordelia Mercer quietly reached for her phone. Because in her mind, that woman had just become a problem. Cordelia Mercer did not rush when she heard the news. She sat comfortably in her penthouse, one leg crossed over the other, the lights of Chicago glowing beyond the glass walls behind her. A glass of red wine rested loosely in her hand while the television murmured low financial updates across the room. When the phone rang, she didn't answer immediately. She let it ring twice. 3 times. Only then did she lift it to her ear. Yes. Boyd's voice came through, careful as always. There was an issue at the house tonight, he said quietly. Cordelia's eyes remained fixed on the skyline. What kind of issue? The heating system shut down upstairs. In the nursery. Cordelia raised an eyebrow, though her expression remained calm. And the baby was crying for some time, Boyd continued. But he's fine now. Cordelia took a slow sip of wine. Who handled it? There was a short pause on the line. The housekeeper. Cordelia's gaze shifted slightly. The cleaning girl? She asked. Yes. Josie. Cordelia said nothing for a moment. Boyd continued carefully. She took the baby outside, wrapped him in a blanket, sat with him for hours. Outside. Cordelia repeated, her voice cool. Yes. And Cade? He returned later and found them in the garden. Cordelia's fingers tightened slightly around the stem of her glass. And another pause. He brought them both back inside. Silence filled the phone for a few seconds. Then Cordelia spoke again, her tone still calm but colder now. Did he say anything? Boyd hesitated. He spoke with her. In the kitchen. About what? I'm not sure. Cordelia ended the call without another word. She placed the phone on the glass table beside her and stared out at the city again. From the outside, Cordelia Mercer looked perfectly composed. Elegant. Controlled. But behind that stillness, her mind was already moving. Cordelia had spent years managing the public face of her brother's empire. Restaurants. Real estate. Corporate investments. Everything that kept the Mercer name respectable in daylight. But she also knew her brother better than anyone. Cade Mercer did not pay attention to staff. Not unless something important had shifted inside him. Cordelia swirled the wine slowly in her glass. A cleaning girl sleeping outside with his baby. And Cade Mercer bringing her inside. Something had changed. And Cordelia Mercer hated change she didn't control. Back at the mansion, the early morning sunlight began to spread across the kitchen floor. Josie sat quietly near the portable crib while Asher slept peacefully under the blue blanket. The warmth of the house had returned after the heating system restarted. But Josie remained close to the crib, almost as if she feared the baby might disappear if she stepped too far away. Cade leaned against the counter across the room. He had not returned to his bedroom. He had not checked his phone. For the first time in a long while, his attention was not on business or territory or money. His attention was on the woman sitting beside his son. After several minutes, Cade spoke. You've been working here 6 months. Josie nodded. Yes, sir. And in 6 months, Cade continued slowly, no one told me you were checking on the baby at night. Josie's shoulders stiffened slightly. Her voice lowered. I didn't want to cause trouble. You didn't, Cade said quietly. She looked up, surprised. I heard him crying sometimes, she explained softly. And the nanny had already gone to sleep. So you just came in? Josie nodded again. He settles easier when someone holds him. Cade studied her carefully. You did that every night? Josie hesitated. Most nights. And no one told me. She looked down again. I figured it wasn't important. Cade's jaw tightened slightly. It was important. More important than he wanted to admit. Because for months, while he walked past the nursery door pretending distance was protection, someone else had been inside the room holding his child. Someone poor. Someone exhausted. Someone who had already lost a child and refused to let another suffer. The thought settled heavily in his chest. Across the kitchen, Asher stirred. A small whimper escaped his lips. Josie stood immediately. Before Cade even moved. She stepped to the crib and gently rested her hand against the baby's chest. Hey there, she whispered softly. Asher's tiny fingers reached blindly for her hand. The moment he found it, his body relaxed again. The baby didn't even open his eyes. But his grip tightened around her finger. Cade watched the moment closely. It lasted only seconds. But something inside him shifted again. A realization he didn't want to fully face yet. His son recognized her. Recognized her comfort. Recognized her presence. More than his own father. Josie slowly pulled her hand away once the baby settled again. She turned slightly and noticed Cade watching. Embarrassment crossed her face. I'm sorry, she said quickly. I didn't mean to. You didn't do anything wrong, Cade interrupted gently. She stopped speaking. For a moment neither of them moved. Then Cade walked toward the doorway. Before leaving the kitchen, he paused. Josie. She looked up. Yes, sir. His voice softened slightly. You're not staff right now. She blinked in confusion. I'm just grateful my son is safe. Josie lowered her eyes again, unsure how to respond. Cade stepped into the hallway and disappeared toward his office. But as he walked away, the thought followed him. A quiet realization that had begun forming since the moment he saw her on that bench in the freezing night. A poor woman who had nothing, had protected the one thing in the world Cade Mercer could not afford to lose. And somewhere deep in the house, the sound of a phone quietly dialing echoed from another room. Because Cordelia Mercer had already decided something. That housekeeper was no longer invisible. And invisible people were easy to ignore. But once someone became visible in the Mercer house, they also became a target. Cordelia Mercer did not wait long. By the next afternoon she arrived at the mansion herself, stepping out of a black car with the same calm confidence she carried into every room. Her heels clicked sharply across the marble floor as she walked inside, Boyd trailing behind her. She didn't greet anyone. She simply asked one question. Where is Cade? In his office, Boyd answered carefully. Cordelia nodded, but her eyes drifted down the hallway toward the nursery. A faint sound reached her ears. Laughter. A baby's soft laugh. She followed the sound quietly until she reached the doorway. Inside the nursery, Josie sat on the floor beside the crib. Asher was sitting in her lap, clutching the collar of her shirt with one hand while she gently tickled his tiny feet. The baby laughed again, his whole face lighting up. Josie laughed too. Not loudly. Just a small, warm laugh that came from somewhere deep inside her chest. For a moment Cordelia stood there watching. Her expression hardened. That laughter didn't belong to a cleaning girl. That kind of connection didn't belong in her brother's house. She turned away and walked toward Cade's office. When she stepped inside, Cade was standing near the window, looking out at the garden. You've been home a lot lately, Cordelia said casually. Cade didn't turn. Something wrong. No. She poured herself a drink from the cabinet. Then why are meetings being cancelled? People are asking questions. Cade finally turned to face her. I'm handling things. Cordelia studied him carefully. And the housekeeper? Cade's eyes narrowed slightly. What about her? Cordelia shrugged lightly. Just curious. She walked slowly around the room. Boyd told me she's been spending a lot of time with the baby. Cade's voice remained calm. She's helping. Cordelia stopped. That's not her job. Cade's gaze stayed steady. She did her job when no one else did. The room fell quiet. Cordelia set her glass down. You're getting attached to the wrong person, Cade. I'm grateful, he corrected. Cordelia laughed softly. To a cleaning girl? Cade didn't respond. But the silence between them said enough. Cordelia's voice lowered. You know what happens when people get too close to power. Cade's expression didn't change. She's not part of this world. She doesn't need to be. Cordelia studied him again, realizing something had shifted. For the first time in years, her brother was protecting someone. And it wasn't family. That realization made her smile thinly. We'll see, she said quietly. That evening the mansion was unusually tense. Staff whispered softly in the kitchen. Boyd moved through the house with careful eyes. And Josie stayed in the nursery, unaware of the quiet storm building around her. Asher slept peacefully in the crib. Josie sat in the rocking chair nearby, humming the same soft hymn she had sung on that cold night. The door opened quietly. Cade stepped inside. He watched her for a moment before speaking. You should rest. Josie looked up. I'm fine. You've barely slept. She smiled gently. Neither have you. Cade walked closer and looked down at his son. Asher shifted slightly in his sleep. Josie, Cade said quietly. Yes. You don't have to stay up every night. She looked at him carefully. I know. But you do anyway. Josie didn't answer immediately. Finally she said softly, I made a promise once. Cade understood. He nodded slowly. You kept that promise for my son. Josie lowered her eyes. He's a good boy. Cade's voice grew quieter. You saved his life. Josie shook her head. I just held him. Cade looked at her then, really looked at her. A woman with tired eyes and worn hands. A woman who had lost everything once, and still chose to love again. He reached into his pocket and placed something gently on the small table beside her. Josie looked down. It was a small brass plaque. The words were simple. The night love kept him warm. She blinked in surprise. Cade spoke softly. I'm putting it on the bench outside. Josie's lips trembled. You don't have to. Yes, he said gently. I do. Days passed. Cordelia tried quietly to push Josie away from the nursery. Whispers started among the staff. But Cade made one thing clear. Josie stayed. And slowly the house changed. Cade began spending more time with his son. At first awkwardly. Carefully. But Josie helped him. Like this, she would say softly, guiding his hands as he held Asher. Babies feel when you're nervous. Cade gave a quiet chuckle. I negotiate with armed men. Babies are tougher, she replied with a small smile. Weeks later, on a calm autumn afternoon, Josie sat on the stone bench in the garden again. But this time she wasn't alone. Asher sat beside her, a little older now, his small legs swinging happily. Cade stood on the balcony above, watching them. The bench looked different now. The plaque had been placed carefully along the stone edge. Josie ran her fingers over the engraved words. Asher looked up at her and suddenly reached his arms around her neck. "Ma," he said softly. Josie froze. Her breath caught. Cade heard it from above. For a moment the world seemed to stop. Josie held the boy tightly. Tears filled her eyes, but she smiled through them. Because for the first time in years, her heart didn't feel broken anymore. Cade came down the steps slowly. He stopped in front of them and looked at the child, then at Josie. There was something clear in his voice when he spoke. "My father once told me love was a weakness." He looked at the plaque on the bench. But he was wrong. Josie looked at him. Cade rested a gentle hand on Asher's head. "Love isn't weakness," he said quietly. "It's the only thing strong enough to save us." The wind moved softly through the garden. For the first time since Levi, Josie felt peace. And Cade Mercer finally understood something his wealth had never taught him. That sometimes the richest thing in the world is simply having someone who refuses to let go. If this story touched your heart, consider subscribing to the channel. And tell us in the comments which region you're watching from.